Good evening. Hi, my name is Jim Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Neenah Historical Society. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'm going to make a couple of comments about upcoming events sponsored by the Historical Society. On November 12th, we have our annual fundraiser. We have information about this event at our desk over here. It's going to be a theme evening. Immigration to Neenah is the current exhibit at the Octagon House. I hope some of you have visited and enjoyed it. That exhibit is about to come down. And so on November 12th, we're having an evening at Ellis Island. So I hope some of you will be able to attend. There's information at the desk. On the 30th, that event is being sponsored by the Kessler-Fahrenkrug Funeral Home. On the 30th of November, we're having another event in this room. Karen Ann Hoffman will be presenting a program on Native American art and storytelling. That event is sponsored by Old National Bank. But for tonight, I'm introducing a former colleague, Becky Heidke Kwiatkowski. Many of you, if not all of you, already know her. She's a longtime employee of the Historical Society. And if you came to the Historical Society with questions about who owned my home originally, or tell me more about my family, more than likely Becky was the person to assist you with that. Becky is still the treasurer of the Historical Society, but now has moved on to a different location. She works at the Kessler-Fahrenkrug Funeral Home. So, this evening she's going to tell you about dearly departed. Becky.
Well, thank you, and I'm so glad we get to all be together again. It's been quite a while since we had a program here at the Neenah Library. I mean, the last time we were here was before Dane was elected mayor, and I was sitting over at the table over there, and you know, now it's 6 months later, and everything just seems so different. But I'm so glad that we could all be together tonight. I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. I had a visit from Tom Sutter a couple of weeks ago. He came to visit me at the funeral home, and he's like, and he came up to me and he said, Becky, I have some grave reservations about this new job that you are undertaking. And I said, oh, Tom, some of you must know him. He's the president of the Appleton Historical Society. But I told him, rest assured, Tom, it's all okay. We're all good. So tonight, what we're going to do is and that will be the end of my terrible jokes, because as much as I enjoy researching and accounting, jokes are not my strong point. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Neenah and Menasha's family-owned funeral homes. I just want to give you kind of an overview of the program, kind of where we're going to go tonight. We're going to start off with a definition of some funeral terms. As somebody who recently started in the funeral industry, they have a lot of different ways they talk about things, and the way they talked about them has changed over the years too. So I thought to help us out, well, I'll talk about some of these terms so we're all on the same page. Then I'll take a brief look at some funeral industry history nationwide, and then we'll we'll compare that to how does that happen versus what we did here in Neenah and Menasha. And then my favorite part, we'll talk about some of the stories from funeral home families in Neenah and Menasha. All right, on to definitions. The first one I wanted to talk about, when we first talk about undertaking and funeral service, we're going all the way back to the 1860s, kind of. And when they first come out, they call it an undertaking service, which basically meant a management of the funeral. What they would do is they would have a mortuary, which would be the place where embalming of a body would occur. And sometimes, depending on how many people had passed away, they might also use what's called a morgue, which is just their fancy word of saying where they're keeping a body. As we move along in history, you'll see the change from things being called an undertaking service to today what we know of as a funeral home. Today, it would be a place where embalming may occur. It doesn't necessarily always occur there. People will come to the funeral home in order to make plans for their loved ones, and sometimes it's where visitations and or service may take place, or they still take place in churches as well. And then people that work at the funeral home, other than the accountants that are working in the basement, we have the embalmers, who are the person who is completing the embalming of the body and prepares it for viewing if that is something that the individual family chooses. If there's a cremation, of course, that wouldn't be part of that process. And then the funeral director is the person who is in charge of helping families with creating a funeral, cremation, memorial service, or celebration of life. They're kind of like the coordinator overall of getting everything done. All right, now on to some more interesting things. So with the funeral industry history, before the Civil War, most of the time, families would do their own burial of their loved ones. They would do a service from home. It could be something very simple. You may have heard of the parlor in the family of the house. That would be typically where a funeral type thing would occur, where the bodies would be, that type of thing. And before the Civil War, embalming really wasn't something that was very common practice. The family would just have their, you'd go get your coffin, have it in the house, and then they'd have a service, and then the family would proceed to the cemetery or wherever they would have the burial. Things changed with the Civil War. At this time, with the soldiers being, like the northern soldiers being in the South, the families wanted an ability to say goodbye to their loved ones. So embalming became something that was a little more accepted, so that the families would be able to say that final goodbye. And the other thing was with Abraham Lincoln. After he passed away, his body made it across the country, and the people heard about it in the newspaper. And it was like, oh, if the president can have his body embalmed and it can look great and get all the way across the country and still look okay, maybe this is something that we want to consider for our loved ones as well. After the Civil War, more people are thinking, embalming, that's an okay thing. That gives us a little more time to be with our loved ones after they pass away. Originally, before funeral homes became popular, it was something that the embalmer would come to your home and do, which is kind of, yeah. Wouldn't have been my first choice, but it's okay. You do what you had to do at the time. And then that's kind of how it was at the time. And then the rituals that would happen for your loved one who passed away, that it would be, there was more of a focus on the process of saying goodbye. There's an emotional ritual that some people could go through, maybe a psychological one. Religion was becoming more popular, and that had its own ways that they wanted to do the religious aspects of a funeral service, or maybe even a cultural one. Kind of like today, each culture has their own accepted way that they want to take care of their ones that passed away. When we were talking about the 1860s to 1880s, typically the furniture stores would be where you would get your coffin from. They didn't really have like a casket store at that point. The furniture store guys were very adept at making anything out of wood. So they would be able to, you know, take the measurements of the person and be like, okay, we'll make you a coffin of this size. In addition to the furniture store, the livery service is which was usually like a horse-drawn carriage kind of thing, would be the people that would be responsible to help assist taking those coffins to the cemetery. Once we get to the process of where embalming is a little bit more accepted, the undertaking service actually develops out as a secondary business out of the furniture stores, the liveries, or even the cemeteries, because they would be like your final destination kind of thing. Funeral homes don't really start to become popular or come into existence until about the 1920s. When we get to the 1920s, homes are changing how they look. You don't see parlors in the front anymore, so there's not really a space in your house to have a funeral service. We have things like automobiles and telephones, so we can call somebody to help us out if we need to. And then there's a way to transport a deceased loved one around. If you remember back to our cemetery walk a couple of years ago, we talked a little about the influenza pandemic, kind of like how we're coming out of COVID now. People were still a little afraid of gathering in groups after the influenza pandemic, so they were a little more hesitant to have a funeral service at their house necessarily. They could have it in a little bit bigger place, then they would be able to have a separate space for their funeral. There's also an increase in sanitation where people wanted to not have a dead body necessarily at their house. If they could have it, if somebody else could taking care of all of that stuff, that would be a lot better. So more people said, yeah, I think we'll have somebody else help us with that. And then a funeral home also provided a larger social space, so that if you had somebody who was well liked or well remembered, they would have a better ability to have a funeral service, so you weren't trying to get crammed into everybody's house. In addition to this, the funeral homes are typically, the owners are living above or next door to the funeral home so that they are close by. Most of the time they would be the ones who would be getting the first call, and they would have somebody at the funeral home would be responsible for picking up the loved one and then doing the arrangements from there. The funeral industry just kept clicking along until we get to about 1963. There's a book, this is the revised version of it, called The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford. For those of you who are not in the funeral industry, it was an interesting book to read. Kind of gives me a perspective, like an all-around perspective of how it is. She took a look at the funeral industry and said, some of the people are getting overcharged for their funerals and things. You know, there's some unscrupulous business people involved. So her book was a big wake-up call to some people. She also questioned if some of the funeral people were exploiting grieving families, where you're in your time of need and you're not necessarily thinking as clearly as you would if you weren't just missing somebody that you loved. And then her book also led to changes in the industry that requires disclosure and itemization of costs, so that families are not surprised by what the final bill is. Also in 1963, there was the funeral of John F. Kennedy. And I'm sure some of you may remember that. It was a big thing on TV where, you saw, to me, I think of, the casket and little John Jr. saluting and everything like that. So there was a kind of a juxtaposition of the information in Jessica's book versus what we saw on TV and coming together as a country kind of to remember a president. Today, when we look at the funeral industry, Cremation is becoming more accepted and more popular. There are still full funerals with burials that still occur. It's a family preference kind of thing. Those of us who work in the funeral homes are assisting and helping families with their deceased loved ones, making sure their final wishes are being met. There is a shift right now to accommodate the preferences of consumers for everything from a cremation to a memorial service, a celebration of life service, versus like a traditional going to the church and to the cemetery type funeral. And then our funeral directors, they'll coordinate any type of service. All right, a couple of funeral industry statistics, because I'm a numbers gal, and I like my numbers. If I took a look at the National Funeral Directors Association statistics, cremation nationally is about 57% and burial at 37%. I know that doesn't equal 100, because there are some that decide on doing it, like donating your body to science or something of that nature. Currently in the United States, there's over 18,000 funeral homes, and most of them are privately owned versus corporately owned. And an average funeral home employs 3 full-time and 4 part-time employees. And then I took a look at kind of where we were at with, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There are about 61,000 people who are in the funeral industry back in 1972, with 14,000 of them women. And if we take a look at a more current number, there's 110,000 in the funeral industry. And the employees that are women have grown substantially. So there are a lot more ladies that are helping out. All right, so now that we've got through the basic history kind of overall, how do Neenah and Menasha compare? If we think back to our Tracing Our Paths exhibit with Neenah, when we were taking a look at like statistics with our immigration and that pre-Civil War, Neenah and Menasha are really little towns. We don't have a whole lot of people here. What we had that matched with the national trends was that in downtown of Neenah and Menasha, we have furniture stores, and the furniture stores are the ones to advertise undertaking services. We have T.D. Phillips from Menasha, that they have undertaking in all of its branches, and it's promptly filled. And then in Neenah, we have Andrew Sorenson and Son downtown with their, we're elegant line of baby carriages, very low prices, and we have undertaking, a complete line in all the latest styles of the goods. You can't really see it here, but it says, let me read it here. It's a little tiny on the screen. It says, orders are filled promptly and cheap. Don't think we have too many of our current funeral homes that are going to put that in there. All right, so then I took a look at our city directories. In 1893, we have the city directory for Neenah and Menasha. We had 3 funeral homes or 3 places. Most of them were the furniture stores that were offering undertaking services with William Beckman, Hans Jorgensen, and Sorenson and Son, who we just saw on the last page. And in Menasha, we had T.D. Phillips and William Laemmrich Jr. When I took a look at the city directories, kind of like on a rolling and going forward basis, originally the funeral people were listed under the undertaking services, and when we get to the 1920s, we start seeing them being called funeral services or funeral directors. The actual funeral home, as a word, starts to appear in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So I took a look at the 1944 city directory, and some of these names might look a little familiar. We have the Kessler Funeral Home, here and Laemmrich Funeral Home. And there was, by 1944, there was also Westgor and Pelton Eckert Funeral Home in Menasha, which I believe was on the island. All right. So now what I wanted to do was to kind of go through the family funeral homes in Neenah-Menasha, kind of give you guys a couple of stories and interesting things that I found out as I was doing some research. I focused on 5 of the major ones. And what I did is I tried to, if I could, interview some descendants, or I conducted some research, took a look at what the files we had at the Neenah Historical Society and my friends at the Menasha Historical Society, like Shirley, my research buddy over here. The two of us, we were able to pull quite a few interesting little tidbits out that I'd like to share. And this is really why you guys came. You didn't really want to hear the other part. I know, it's okay. Now on to the fun stuff. All right, the first one we're going to look at, we're going to take a look at the Laemmrich Funeral Home in Menasha. This is one of the longest lasting funeral establishments in Menasha. Originally we have Gottlieb and William Laemmrich. They immigrated from Saxony and arrived in Menasha about 1852. So they were here quite a long time. Originally, they had a downtown store on Main Street with furniture and coffins, and they were excellent woodworkers, from what I understand. William carved the altars for many churches, including St. Mary's Church in Menasha. Kathy Humsky from the Menasha Historical Society shared the St. Mary's Parish Memories book for 125 years in Menasha. And in this book, they actually have pictures of some of the carvings that William did, and they figured that they were installed about 1890. After William Sr. Was kind of like the original one who did the woodworking, the coffin making, and things, and started the funeral home before it was called the funeral home. William Sr. tragically passed away in 1895, 6 weeks after his son Alexander died. Yeah, and I think it could have been from a broken heart, because it sounded like their family was hit pretty hard by Alexander's passing. His other son, William Jr., runs the undertaking and the funeral establishment. And William then trains his sons, Joseph and Clem. These pictures are from one of the little history books from the Laemmrich Funeral Home that we have, if I can find it here. Has a little photo of the funeral home and the information about their history that Clem wrote. I think most of you who've been around for a while remember the Laemmrich nativity scene. Originally it was known as Little Bethlehem. And instead of actually reading this whole thing to you, one of the things that my friends at Menasha shared with me was one of their newsletters where Dick Laemmrich wrote about the tradition of the Little Bethlehem nativity scene. So I'm going to read it to you in Dick's words instead of mine. How a tradition was born. In the middle 1930s, my father, Clem W. Laemmrich, and Henry Ellinger, father of the late Mickey Ellinger, made some wood sheep and a manger scene out of wood using a jigsaw. They also decided to make a crib and a miniature church. When it was completed, it was placed in a rock garden located in the northwest corner of what is now Laemmrich's parking lot, where there was also a 3-car garage. The family home was on the corner of 3rd and Milwaukee Street. At that time, there was only a single-car driveway going around the funeral home. Shortly after World War II, Clem and Henry built a new church in the basement of the Ellinger home on Prospect Street. They concentrated their efforts on making a beautiful church, and as many others have done, didn't bother to measure or plan on how they would get this church out of the basement. Eventually, the church had to be cut into 2 pieces in order to remove it. After that, my dad made the present crib. He went to Menasha Wood Split Pulley Works, which is presently on Old Pulley Lane. And using a bandsaw, Chick Lawson and Andrew Bayer split the fence post for my dad to use in the crib. It is well made and very heavy. Shortly after completing the crib, my dad made the present church. Dad was a very good carpenter, and Dick says, I cannot pound a nail straight. We've had the nativity scene in many places, and for the past 15 years or so, it has been located in the parking lot. During the 1940s, we probably had 5 trees at the most. Today, we order approximately 30 trees. We have in excess of 3,000 lights. The present statues were purchased about 10 years ago, and we frequently add to them. The scaffolding used to create a mountain scene was purchased from the Charles Gamsky Company when they discontinued their construction business. It takes 3 to 4 men at least 10 days to build the scene each year, and then you pray that the electricity stays on. And from what I understand, the whole time that every year that was a constant concern, was to make sure that electricity stayed up. Dick said, I have said it many times, this is the last year, but my family keeps saying, no, it's a tradition. With this display, in 2002, it was donated to the St. Patrick's Church, and it is currently on display. Yep, if you remember St. Patrick's, it's on Doty Island, so that hopefully this year you'll be able to go check it out. All right, then with the Laemmrich Funeral Home, they moved from the downtown store to 312 Milwaukee Street in 1928. There were major remodels done to the building in 1961 and in 1974. The ownership passed from William Jr. to Clem, and then from Clem to his son Dick. The advertisement that you're seeing on the screen was from the formal grand opening of the enlarged Laemmrich Funeral. Dick Laemmrich ran the business with his son until 1997. At that time, the business was sold and is corporately owned. The building is still standing and is part of the Wickman Funeral Homes as part of their Laemmrich Chapel. All right. Also in Menasha, we have the Brown Funeral Home, which this was on Broad Street. Taylor Brown purchased the building that was on the prior slide in 1960. He was a mortician from Oshkosh. The building was converted to the second funeral home in Menasha and had a chapel to it. And then Victor Kwiatkowski. You would think a Polish girl would know a little bit better how to pronounce it, but apparently not. Thank you. He eventually purchased this funeral home in 1971, and a few years later became the mayor of Menasha. For the Browns, one of the things that stood out for me with them was the Brown ambulance service in Menasha. In 1961, they had the ambulance that was air conditioned. I know. In March of 1961, he offered the ambulance service to the city of Menasha for $8 a call. It didn't last very long, unfortunately. He ended up selling his ambulance to the Lindy Ambulance Service in Appleton. And for those of you who were wondering, Neenah didn't have an ambulance service that needed to be separately outsourced. It was done by the fire department. All right. the Heuer Funeral Home. I'm going to guess that most of you probably have not heard of this funeral home, and I hadn't either. What happened was, at the Neenah Historical Society, we have a lady who every once in a while would email us and say, I found this really cool thing in my father or my grandfather's things, but it's not something that I really have any use for. Would you guys like it? So it would be like a little trinket or a little piece of paper or something like that. And she would do fantastic research on whatever this item was. And I thought, this is great. And one of the times that she sent us something, and I don't even remember what it was anymore, but she said, I was looking on your website, and I see that you guys are going to do a presentation on funeral homes. And guess what? My family owned the Heuer Funeral Home. So, and then she said, would you like me to send you some information and some pictures? And I said, yes, please send me some pictures and some information. So this section is mostly courtesy of Beth Overstad from Minneapolis, and I thank her for answering all of my hundreds of questions. Her grandfather was Ernst Heuer. He was a German immigrant, originally trained as a carpenter, as we see. In 1899, he had an injury involving his thumb that made it so he couldn't grip and be able to do things as a carpenter. So he had to make a career change. Originally, he started in Dale, Wisconsin, and then moved to Omro and New London to be an undertaker at a furniture store. And he also was a traveling salesman with the undertaking supplies, which was what the embalmers would use when they would come to the houses to do embalming, and then later at the funeral homes. And he also sold some caskets. In 1933, he moves to Neenah, and he purchases a building on Church Street from the Knights of Pythias, or Pythias, I'm not really sure. Pythias, thank you, where Ernst is a member. And they were selling their clubhouse, and he thought, oh, this would be a great place to build, or to open a funeral home. Ernst also sold burial vaults, which are what you need at the cemetery to put the casket in, so that at the cemetery the ground stays somewhat flat and not super bumpy. The building on Church Street was converted to a funeral home and opened in January of 1934. Tragically, Ernst dies in 1940, where his wife, Maud, decided to run the funeral home for a little while until she ends up selling it to a guy you might have heard of, John Westgor. This ad is from the Neenah Daily News Times that talks about the great pride of Heuer service is that they have a personal service because they lived at the funeral home, just like some of our other families do. And somebody is always on duty night and day, and that your loved one is never alone. Beth was nice enough to share some memories that she talked to her father about. Her father grew up on in the funeral home, living above it with his parents. And she told me that her dad had a typical Neenah childhood. He would be the one who would be fishing in the slough. He would look for Native American beads out at the point, and they'd play marbles in the lot by the A&W restaurant. And then she also told me that he was allowed to have pets, but they had to be quiet pets. And she said the quiet pets that he had included a guinea pig, tadpoles, and a 12-inch alligator. Not sure what happened to the alligator, but not quite sure that it would be there.
It went in the slough.
It went in the slough. You know, I was tempted to look to see if there was an article about an alligator in the slough in the 1940s or 50s, but I didn't. Beth also shared with me that her family was part of the business from start to finish, to helping with preparing the bodies, to driving the cars in the funeral procession. She told me, and I didn't write down which of her relatives it was, but one of the boys at age 12 learned how to drive so that he would be able to help out with the funeral, so he could drive the flower car and be able to help take all the things around. The Heuer family was also members of the First Presbyterian Church. And one of the things that I wanted to, with the photos here, there's Ernst and Maud, and Gordon King, I believe, is a grandson. This photo over here was taken from the alley behind the funeral home at the time. And the photo on the right is of Ernst and Maud. And she told me that everybody had to be properly dressed at all times. Included when Ernst in this photo, you can't really tell, but apparently he had to have his tie with his tie pin, because you never knew, even when he was out mowing the grass. Beth also shared with me that after she sold the funeral establishment, that Maud went on to work as a private nurse, and from what we have figured out, that she may have been the private nurse for John Nelson Bergstrom and worked with their family. Because Beth said she has a lot of memories of going out to the museum, to Bergstrom Mahler Museum, when she was a kid. All right, so after the Heuer Funeral Home, we end up going to the Westgor Funeral Home. Originally, John purchased an interest in the Heuer Funeral Home at 117 Church Street, and later he became the sole owner. John grew up in Peshtigo and helped with the funerals when he was younger. He graduated from mortuary school in Chicago and then came to Neenah. The little advertisement towards the bottom talks about the announcement of the partnership between John Westgor and Mrs. Heuer. John and Alberta, which some of you may know her as Waggy, assumed full ownership of the funeral home in 1941. And then shortly after, John decided to enlist in the Army and served from March of 1945 until May of 1946. So Waggy is at home, trying to run the funeral home, and has 2 young sons. Apparently she did a really good job. She had some help from the Laemmrich family to make sure that all of the embalming and that type of stuff could occur. But from what I understand, Waggy was a pretty good nurse on her own. So for the Westgors, Ted grew up in Neenah in the funeral home. They lived above. And then Ted later on became part of the business in 1973 and assumed the ownership in 1985 when John and Waggy retired. For Westgor, they decided to take down the old clubhouse and build a wonderful new building in 1994. This is a picture of the current building that faces Doty Street. They also have a Menasha location that was added in 1998. And the third generation, Sarah Westgor, joins the business in 1999. Today, Sarah Westgor and Bob Carmen are current owners. One of the nice things about the Westgor family that I found very interesting was all that John, Ted, and Sarah all have served as presidents of the Neenah Rotary Club. Ted was also a big part of the Neenah Historical Society. He also did a presentation about funeral industry type things quite a few years ago, way before my time. But he was able to do that. And then Becky Westgor, who is pictured in the corner below, she contributed over 3,000 hours to the Neenah-Menasha Red Cross. Okay. For those of you who have come to the cemetery walk the last couple of years, you've had the opportunity to take a look at the chapel out at the cemetery, out at Oak Hill. This chapel was a gift to the city of Neenah from D.W. Bergstrom in 1924. Next to this building, there's a receiving vault, which basically means it's where they store the bodies in the winter when they were unable to do burials, which was donated by the Babcock family at the same time, which is why the buildings look similar. Originally, the use of the chapel was free. It was used for funerals, for people who didn't have as much money, kind of a thing, or if they wanted to have it there. Or sometimes they would use it for a committal ceremony, where like if someone passed away out of state or out of the area, they could come to the chapel and have their service there. I hope the mayor doesn't mind, but I understand that there are some people that are taking a look to see if we can do upgrades or something to the chapel so it can be used for a different purpose. They're doing some investigative work at this time. Is that okay? Okay. Before I get myself in trouble. All right. Okay, now we're on to the last part. Earlier we talked about the Sorenson and Son funeral home. This is a different ad of theirs with their furniture and their special attention to undertaking. The Sorenson family, Andrew Sorenson was the Danish immigrant. He came to Neenah in 1867. This photo is actually of his son Charles. Andrew operated a furniture store in downtown Neenah. It's next door to where Greens is today. From the research that I've done with Andrew, when he came to Neenah, he came with his son Charles, a younger son, and his wife, and the wife passed away within 2 weeks of their arrival in Neenah. Charles here and his dad Andrew, they had a rough time of it for a while. They didn't really see eye to eye, but eventually the two of them came together, and Charles decided he was going to work with his dad in the furniture business. And then his dad said, well, guess what? You know, we have this undertaking thing. You're going to do it. So Charles takes the undertaking things up. Charles runs the business. I'm not really sure why, but if we look in the slide before, Andrew spelled his name with S-O-N, but sometime after Charles took over, he changed it to S-E-N. I'm not sure why. Charles ran the furniture store and the undertaking business. His son, Charles Jr., later joins the business, and it is renamed as Sorenson and Son. The building that you see pictured here was originally on Church Street. This was what they used as their morgue at first for their bodies. And then they made it into a chapel where they could hold services. Unfortunately, this building is no longer in existence. But space became an issue with the Sorenson furniture store and having the chapel and having to run in between the two if they were trying to do things. So Charles is on the lookout, and he's looking for a new place to have a business, and he sees this little house. And he thinks, this is a great location. If you may not recognize all of this building now, because it looks a little different today, but this is 304 South Commercial Street. It was originally the home of Hattie Stritty Burke, built in the 1870s. And after Hattie passed away, and it was apartments, Charles bought it from her widower and decided this would be a great place to have a funeral home. It has a nice location, we can have some parking, and it looks like a home, and we can have everything all in one place. So he does some remodeling and establishes a new funeral home in 1934. There was an interview with Charles Sorenson in 1945 in the Neenah Daily newspaper that kind of went through Charles's life and his career and how they, made different, with the coffins and everything, and he kind of walked everybody through his business. And when he retired from the furniture business in 1945, he left the funeral business in 1940. One of the things that he said was, or that they said in the newspaper, was that with Sorenson and Son ending as a business institution, there were only 2 other stores that had histories that were longer than Sorenson and Son Funeral Home. And that would be the William Kruger Hardware Company, which you guys know as Kruger Hardware today, and it's still going on. And the other one was Heuer's Drugstore. And then all 3 of the businesses, the Kruger Hardware, Heuer's Drugstore, and Sorenson and Son, that all 3 of them were operated by descendants of the founders in the 1940s, which I thought was pretty cool, pretty fun little article. Art Kessler becomes a funeral apprentice for Charles Sorenson Sr. The original intent was probably to have Charles Jr. Take on the family business, but he unfortunately passed away unexpectedly in 1945. So Art and his wife Margaret became the business owners in 1940. They purchased the business from Charles Sorenson Sr. And in 1941, they renamed their business the Kessler Funeral Home. Margaret was one of the early female funeral directors, and she was pretty involved in the business. One of the things, as I've learned a little bit more about Margaret at the funeral home, was that Margaret was a grieving person herself. Her brother was a World War I soldier who passed away in France. I believe there is a post that is named after him over in the Whitelaw area. So for me, one of the things, it's one thing to work in the funeral industry if it's something that that's like your passion and something that you like, and it's a completely different thing when it's when you've had tragedies happen to you in your life and you can still be able to say, yes, I want to help people and I want to be a part of this business as well. With the Kessler Funeral Home, they did do a remodel and expansion of the property in 1960 to make it look more like what it looks like today. Art and Margaret had 5 kids that lived in the apartment above the funeral home property. But Art and Margaret also owned a couple of the houses and things like around them, so that the kids could go run around and make noise somewhere else instead of being there for the funerals. Their son George joined the family business in 1966 and became an owner in 1972. This advertisement is one from the 100th anniversary of Neenah and Menasha becoming cities. And this is the only one that we're aware of that actually has a picture of Charles Jr. And this is original Charles, Charles Sr., Charles Jr., Art Kessler, and George Kessler. I have a little more access to fun photos working at the Kessler-Fahrenkrug Funeral Home. So I pulled out a couple of these because I thought they were kind of fun. This photo here, if you look up, it happens to be a winter photo. The Kesslers had a live nativity scene at Christmas time to try to compete with the Laemmrichs at the time. So that's theirs. And this one was just a fun photo that I enjoyed taking out in front of the building, and you can kind of see the change in the building from the top one to this one. And if you think about where it is today, like this part is still here, this part is still here, and then this is more covered up. We don't have a second drive-through. There's also a cute little, like we have for the Laemmrichs, there's a cute little booklet from the 1960s that showed the what the interior looked like of the Kessler funeral home. So this one kind of shows like a couple of different places. And then these are more current photos. These two photos here, you're looking the opposite way. So like this, the top of this light fixture is that one up there, and it's still there. And then what we currently see here as the lunchroom in the booklet, they talk about having a north chapel and a south chapel. And then today they changed one of the chapels into a lower lunchroom area, so families can gather there as well. George Kessler performs funeral services for over 50 years, and he retired in 2017. And currently, Patrick Fahrenkrug is our current owner, and he changed the business name to include his name this year. Now my favorite part. When I was looking around in the files and things, we have records at the funeral home from way back to Charles Sorenson. They have like these little books of history, and they have like a listing of all of the people who passed away and all the funeral services that they did. So we've got them from the 1890s all the way through. So the Charles Sorenson's 1890s through 1940, they look like this. It was interesting to page through them and take a look. They kind of read, if you think about it, the Kessler-Fahrenkrug funeral home, the history goes back to the 1886. So when I was looking through these kind of read like a who's who of Neenah at the time. This one is 1891 in September, October, and right here is when Charles Clark passed away in New York. This is the record of him being sent back to Neenah, and then Charles Sorenson was able to help with the burial. They're fascinating to look at, but very hard to read. And that's the ending of our presentation. I wanted to say thank you to Shirley from Menasha Historical Society for helping, and for Beth for all of the wonderful information that she gave me. And then if you guys have any questions, feel free to come up and talk to me, and then I'll answer them up here. Otherwise, thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again.